It's a real pleasure to be doing this. I recently did a course on Cuba for Academy, which was very well received. And so it was suggested maybe we could do a special one-off on what's happening at the moment. And that's why I'm here. As Stuart said, I am the director of a study for the Institute of Cuba here in the UK. It's based at the University of Buckingham, where I teach. I'm a senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Buckingham. Now, I was going to start with the events themselves that happened on July the 11th. You know, we woke up here in the UK to news of demonstrations across Cuba. There were some very alarming pictures on the TV news of people shouting for freedom and so on in the streets of Cuba, which is a very unusual occurrence. Nothing like that has happened since 1994, and in 1994, that was the first time anything like that had happened since Fidel Castro took power. I can see actually Prudence is already asking questions. She's mentioned that Castro was an idealist in the early days, but became an autocrat. Or at what stage did he lose the support of the people? If he did, well, that's a good point. Demonstrations in Cuba are rare because, in general, the people in Cuba are very supportive of their government. Even now, after Fidel Castro has died and Raul Castro has stepped into retirement, and now a new president has taken over, a guy called Miguel Diaz-Canel, who's now president, and is actually also been made recently the secretary or the general secretary of the Communist Party. So he's not only the president of the country, he's also the head of the political party. And of course, Cuba is a single party system, so he's the head of the only political party there is. And so it's very unusual that people should voice opposition in the way they did in Cuba a few weeks ago. So it is a surprising incident, and that may account for the fact that it got such high level coverage in the news. And that sort of is very alarming for some people. And it's for other people, it kind of confirms a view that really the Cuban government is very unpopular. Now, I think that's a mistake, and I can give some reasons for that. And it may be surprising for people to hear someone say that. But my experience of visiting Cuba tells me that the majority of Cubans are, if you ask them, very loyal to the system. But those are the people that are in Cuba. The point to make, first of all, is that most of the people that are opposed to the system in Cuba aren't living in Cuba. They're living somewhere else. Most of them are actually living in the United States. And in the United States, most of them are living in Florida. Because the system in Cuba is such that if you're opposed to it, then life is pretty unbearable from the point of view of actually being able to do much about it. So most people that are have been in the past opposed to the communist system in Cuba, if they get the opportunity, they leave. And so there is no real opposition inside the island. And so the only opposition that can be developed there is amongst young people who obviously haven't had the experience that their parents have had or their grandparents have had, which may account for the reason why, when you saw the pictures of the people demonstrating, very large numbers of them were young people. I'll come back to the reasons for that as well. There are other reasons for that, and I'll come back to those as well later on. So the first point to point out is that it's unusual because there's an enormous amount of loyalty amongst Cuban people for their revolutionary project. Now, the response of the government was very interesting because the government didn't send the riot police onto the streets to stop this. The government actually, or the president, Diaz-Canel, went on television. Well, actually, the first thing he did was go to the place where these demonstrations had started, which was a small town outside Havana, about 25 kilometers from Havana, called San Antonio de los Baños. And it was there where the first demonstrations took place. And the president actually went to the place, to the streets, to actually talk to the people who were doing the demonstrating. That was the first thing that happened, but then it started to spread across the country, and these demonstrations started to happen all across the country. So then in the afternoon, Diaz-Canel went on television and he called on Cubans who were loyal to the revolution to go onto the streets and counter demonstrate and tell people that the streets of Cuba belonged to the revolution. And that's what happened. So literally hundreds of thousands of Cubans who were loyal to the revolution went out onto the streets and more or less stopped the demonstrations. The people that were demonstrating were outnumbered by them, and they went home in most cases. In some cases, it resulted in violence, and there were fights, and then the police had to get involved. And in a couple of places in Havana, there were real riots where people looted shops and overturned police cars and stoned the police. And then the government had to use the security forces in order to arrest and stop the violence. But this was actually quite a small incident. There wasn't a lot of people involved in this, maybe a few hundred. In total across the island, we estimate maybe something like 3,000 people may have participated in total in all of these demonstrations, which aren't very large. If you compare what has been happening in other places, the most sort of closest place to Cuba where there's been civil unrest recently is Colombia. And in Colombia, if you care to Google it, you'll see images of massive demonstrations on the streets by citizens that are being put down by tear gas, and in some cases by the police actually shooting live rounds into the crowds to disperse them, and military vehicles patrolling the streets of Bogota, firing on people as they go down the streets. So the scenes and the size of the demonstrations in places like Colombia, or if I might say Haiti, where the president has just been assassinated, these destabilizing incidences in these other countries are on a much vaster scale to what happened in Cuba on July the 11th. So the interesting question is, why did these people do what they did? And how really significant is it? Well, the first thing to say is that there are a number of causes for what happened. The first thing to say is that people in Cuba at the moment are not able to leave the island. I mean, legally, because the United States has more or less stopped accepting migrants legally. They aren't giving visas away to the Cubans. And the reasons for that are not related directly to decisions that have been made in Washington about not giving visas. It's to do with the fact that there are not enough personnel in the US Embassy in Havana to actually go through the paperwork to issue the visas. So there is a massive backlog of visa applications from people that want to migrate to the United States legally. Now, you may be unaware of the fact that it has been possible for quite some time for Cubans to obtain visas to travel to the United States legally. And what is very interesting about that is that that became possible after the last time an incident like this took place. So the last time, as I mentioned, an incident like this in Cuba took place in 1994. Now, in 1994, there were what was known as food riots. People were actually hungry in 94. If you remember, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and most of Cuba's trade, more than 90% of it, was with the former Soviet Union and the Eastern European satellite states. And when they folded, the communist systems there folded, Cuba was left without any trading partners. GDP fell by 35%, and there was severe shortages of food, and there were very serious rationing of electricity and power, which meant that there were power cuts every day for most people in the country, which lasted for very many hours in many cases. So, and there was no transport. The situation in Cuba was really very dire, and some people in Havana rioted and looted a shop, and that demonstration was numbering maybe 300 or 400 people, but it was also followed by the murder of a policeman who had tried to stop some people from stealing a boat to try and leave Cuba illegally and go to the United States. So back in 94, when that happened, Fidel Castro was still in power. He said immediately that the situation was intolerable and that if anybody really wanted to leave, he wasn't going to stop them. And that provoked what was known as the Rafters crisis of 94. Now, maybe you will remember what happened. The situation suddenly became a crisis in the United States because people in Cuba started to build rafts and set off in an attempt to row all the way to Florida. Well, of course, what they were doing was rowing out to sea, and then were hoping to be picked up and rescued and taken to the United States. So in the prelude to that incident in 1994, there had been numerous people trying to leave Cuba in boats for some time, and they were being rescued in the sea by an organization set up in Florida by Miami-based Cubans who were opposed to Fidel Castro's government, and they were flying planes over the ocean and spotting these people in rafts, and then conveying to the Coast Guard authorities in the United States the location of these people in rafts. And the US Coast Guard had been picking these people up and taking them to the United States. In this way, a kind of an avenue had been opened up for people who wanted to leave Cuba to risk getting in boats and going. But when Fidel Castro's own Coast Guard had been stopping these people, picking them up and taking them back to Cuba, when he said anybody who wants to leave can go, he meant that the Coast Guard of Cuba wasn't going to stop you. So the thing was that there was an opportunity there for anybody to get in a raft, and so long as they got out of Cuban waters, out of the 12-mile limit, they were in international waters. They were then hoping that, as had happened to previously, that the US Coast Guard was going to come out and rescue them and take them to the United States. And then when they got to the United States, they would be able to stay, because in the United States, there's a a law known as the Cuban Adjustment Act, which makes a very special case for Cuban migrants. That was passed in 1966. And the Cuban Adjustment Act basically says that if you're a Cuban migrant, illegal migrant, who arrives in the United States, you're entitled to stay. You're entitled to a green card, which obviously means that you can work, and you're entitled to the right to residency with a fast track to citizenship within 3 years. So if you make it to the United States as a Cuban, basically you get a green card straight away. That makes Cubans very different from any other nationality. I don't think Australians are any different. If you or I went to the United States and overstayed our visa, we would be illegals and we would be subject to deportation. No other nationality has the benefits that the Cubans have, and that's a Cold War legacy, right? Cubans were given this, let's say, privilege during the Cold War. They are considered as refugees and escapees from communism, and therefore have the right to United States residency. If they arrive, they're considered to be asylum seekers rather than economic migrants or anything like that. So there is a huge incentive for people to try and leave Cuba. So that's what happened. People started in '94 to leave the island in large numbers. We're talking about, you know, on the first day, 300 to 400 people arriving suddenly on the, you know, in Florida, and then the next day 500, and the next day 600, and the next day 800, and pretty much soon you're into thousands of people floating in the sea, being picked up by the Coast Guard. And suddenly there's a huge problem, because people in the United States, in Florida, are saying, you know, what's going on? You know, we can't deal with this situation. And the federal government, Bill Clinton, had to step in. And the response was, if you are picked up in the sea by the US Coast Guard, you will be returned to Cuba. But because there was no agreement at that time between the United States and Cuba on returning migrants, the United States couldn't get the Cuban government to accept them back. And so they started to return these people to that piece of territory that the United States controls in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. So before Guantanamo Bay was a place where they put these arrestees accused of terrorism, Guantanamo Bay was a place where they put Cubans who had been rescued in the sea during the Rafters crisis of 1994. Within a few days, couple of weeks, there were something like 5,000 Cubans in Guantanamo Bay. And at the height of the problem, there were something like 20,000 Cubans in Guantanamo Bay. And so it became a huge kind of detention center, which was itself a massive problem, because Guantanamo Bay is in a desert. It's like 40 degrees and really dry. And it's very, very unpleasant climate. And so if you've been kept in a camp, what amounts to a refugee camp, sleeping in a tent in Guantanamo Bay, it's very, very unpleasant. So there were problems there. Cubans rioted there, in fact, in Guantanamo Bay at that time. So this was a real problem for the Americans, and it resulted in Bill Clinton actually arranging for talks with the Castro government. It wasn't at presidential level. Bill Clinton didn't meet Fidel Castro, but officials from both governments actually met, and they talked about migration. For the very first time, in fact, since the revolution, there was an agreement between the two governments about migration issues. And the United States acknowledged that there was a need for an avenue of legal migration, that there was significant demand in United States, for people who had family and relatives still in Cuba, there was a legitimate demand from them that they should have the right to see their family members, and that there would be cause for them to join them in the United States. And so the United States agreed that they would give 20,000 visas per year to Cubans. And the visa also allowed for the spouse of the person who received the visa to obtain a visa. So that means actually that the United States would give up to 40,000 visas every year to Cubans since 1994. So every year since 1994, the United States had been giving visas to Cubans to allow them to travel to the United States legally. Now, that's an interesting fact, but if you think about that, that means up to 40,000 people per year since 1994. So 95, 2005, 10 years, 2005 to 2015, 20 years, 20 times 40,000, you're getting up to a lot of Cubans who have left the island in that time. Now, this sets up a really interesting problem, because it means there is actually a decline in the population of Cuba. It's not a very large decline. The birth rate is sufficient to kind of almost maintain the population, but it is not enough to maintain it. So we've had a gradual reduction in the population of Cuba in absolute terms in the last few years. And it means that there are large numbers of working age Cubans who are leaving the island. Of course, not everybody who's been obtaining a visa has been of working age, because many aging relatives have been looking for ways to join their younger relatives who might have migrated earlier in Cuba. But very, very large numbers, significant numbers of the people applying for these visas are young people who want to get a better life for themselves, but also be able to send money back to their family in the United States. And this means that there is a very, very large number of Cubans living in the United States now who are actually there as means to support their families on the island. And a very, very large and significant income stream for ordinary Cubans comes from remittances now, from family members. Oh, I've got a question from Anita, who's asked, what criteria was applied to decide which ones were granted a US visa? This is a really good question. What the United States did, and this indicates the, I mean, I'll tell you the method they used, and then I'd ask you to think about the consequences of that. The United States used a lottery. They basically said, we will give 20,000 visas a year, and we will issue them on the basis of a lottery. So they weren't issued on the basis of need. They were issued on the basis of drawing out the names of people from a hat. So, of course, what you got then was very large numbers of Cubans applying for a visa. So it's very unfair to those that actually have a genuine reason to migrate, because, of course, they would apply, but they were in the same hat as hundreds of thousands of others who were just having a punt, just having a hope that they would get it. So this engenders a great deal of problems in society, right? And then the issuing of the visa had to be done in person. So people would have to apply for the visa at was then, it wasn't an embassy then, because the embassy was opened by Obama in 2015. It was an interest section in Cuba. That resulted in people having to travel to Havana to get their visa, and they'd be told to arrive, to go on a certain day. And so constantly there was a queue of people outside the interest section in Havana waiting to go in to get their visa every single day. So there was this visible queue of people lined up to get their visa. So you can see it was used by the United States in a quite cynical way to engender problems for the Cubans. But that's how they did it, by a lottery. Now, the thing was that this situation changed the politics in Florida to some extent. There was a significant number now of Cubans in Florida who were not there because really they were opposed to the political system in Cuba. They were there because they'd taken advantage of this visa system to get to the United States in order to be able to support their families. And most of the migration since, in this later period, in the 90s, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been economic rather than political. And so there is a significant number of people in Florida now who aren't necessarily fundamentally opposed to the Cuban system. They are later arrivals who still have large families living in the United States. The earlier people who migrated during the Cold War period, there was a wave of migration in 1980, there was a wave of migration in the late 60s, and there was a wave at the very early part of the revolution in 59, 61. Those people who are aging and have established lives in the United States and so on, those people tend to be extremely anti-Castro and anti-communist. But the people that have left in the 90s, they grew up in the revolution, they still have family on the island, they have a more nuanced view. They may not be particularly keen in some cases on the Cuban communist system, but they aren't antithetical and really opposed to it. And in fact, they've still got people on the island that are members of their family, and they want to support them. So they tend to be in favor of there being contact. They tend to be in favor of being able to send money to their family, and they tend to want to be able to visit, and they tend also to want for their family members, if they not necessarily migrate permanently, but also come to the United States and visit them. They want a kind of normal relationship between the two countries, and they don't particularly want to overthrow the Cuban system. So there is a split in Florida in the Cuban community between of this nature. Now, that split widened for a while during the Bush administration in the early 2000s. And it did open up the avenue for subsequently the Democrats to do rather well in Florida on the basis that they were going to be in favor of engagement with Cuba. And in fact, Obama won in Florida on a ticket which was to say, I'm going to be easier on Cuba. I'm going to allow more remittances to go to the island, and I'm going to allow you to visit the island more frequently than you have done in the past. He kind of appealed to that section of the Cuban population in Florida, and he managed to split the Cuban American vote in Florida sufficiently to give him an advantage, which he ultimately meant that he won in Florida. And it probably also enabled him to make this overture to Cuba at the latter part of his presidency, which led to the opening up. Now, I've spent a lot of time explaining all this because it is important context to understand what happened on July the 11th. And then the reason for that is this, that Trump reversed the relationship, which had been moving towards cooperation and moving towards engagement of the United States with Cuba. So not only was there a freer migratory situation, whereby Cubans were actually allowed to leave the island by the government. The government removed all restrictions on travel for Cuban citizens. And that meant that Cubans were free to visit the United States if they could get a visa to visit. And Cubans were able to visit, Cuban Americans were able to visit their families in Cuba. That situation was freed up. So there were literally hundreds of thousands of Cubans from the United States visiting Cuba every year. And tourism was opened up. And if any of you were on any of the tours that we ran with Academy Travel, you'll know that the last time we visited with Academy Travel, we couldn't get in the hotels we wanted because they were full of Americans. The situation was that there was, literally something like 400,000 US citizens, not Cuban Americans, traveling to Cuba every year. And this was significantly altering the economic situation on the island. I mean, there were very large numbers. These large numbers of tourists meant that there was a very important tourism business going on in Cuba, which is actually also being invested in by American companies. Obama allowed Marriott, for example, to get involved with Cuban companies to run hotels for American tourists. And it was looking really good. I mean, the prospects for the future were looking really good. They were building very brand new 5-star hotels in Havana, some very beautiful and interesting architecturally, let's say, hotels were going up in Havana, big ones, to accommodate American tourists. And cruise ships were allowed to dock in Havana, and they built a new terminal to accommodate the cruise ships in Havana Harbor, which, as you know, contain literally thousands of tourists who were then getting off the ship and pouring into Havana and going around old Havana and eating in the restaurants and shopping and so on. And this was massive boom, if you like, for even ordinary Cubans, because the reforms in Cuba have allowed Cubans to run businesses, which of course are directed towards tourism. So if you visit Havana, you'll see that there are literally hundreds of small restaurants that are run by Cuban entrepreneurs, private restaurateurs, and there are countless bed and breakfast places, and even small hostels and hotels that are being run by Cubans, private enterprise. And there are markets where people are selling souvenirs, which are handmade, things like T-shirts, dresses, hats, all kinds of statues and carvings and all kinds of stuff to tourists. So people and art, people are painting and selling their art. You go down old Havana streets and there are people displaying art in their lounges, and you can go into their lounge and buy art from them. I mean, there are lots and lots of people in Cuba making a living from this tourism. I got a question from Edna. Does Cuba still operate with a local peso and a separate peso worth much more for foreigners as a kind of tax on foreigners? Well, no. And that's another thing that is important in understanding what happened in July the 11th, because they stopped this dual currency system. And back just in January this year, they unified the currency. They removed this tourist currency, if you like, which was called the convertible peso, which, as Edna says, was worth much more than the national peso. They removed it from circulation, and they just have one currency now, which has caused problems for people. And I'll have to take some time to explain that, and I'll come back to that. I just want to say that this has created a very large, the tourism in particular has created a very large element in Cuban society who work for themselves. And even taxi drivers work for themselves now. And you can imagine how much money taxi drivers made from tourists. So, and then you also have in the tourist business, of course, people who work in it, the waiters and the barmen and the concierges and the porters and the cleaners, who all get an augmentation of their salary in tips. So tourism, figures as being worth 11% of the GDP. 11% of the GDP, which is a very large amount. But it's also the wealth that's created in tourism in Cuba. A very large section of it is acquired by this band of people that work from it, and large numbers of those are self-employed. So you've got something like in Cuba now 600,000 people, nearly a million, getting on for a million people who actually are self-employed, and most of those people are in some way connected to tourism. So what has happened? We've had this pandemic, and Cuba responded to the pandemic in exactly the same way that you guys did in Australia and New Zealand. They closed the borders. They stopped travel. So basically they sacrificed 11% of their GDP. But more than that, of course, they affected the lives directly of a very large number of people who'd come to live from the tourist trade. And those people had lived very well. I mean, they made a very good living out of it. And so they got accustomed to a certain lifestyle. And of course, they had savings. Now, what has happened is that those people have spent all their savings. They've got no income because that's how they made their living. And now they are basically dependent entirely on the Cuban state for their well-being. And of course, that means they have to accept, the rations, because Cuba has a rationing system, and everybody's entitled to a certain amount of food and certain amount of necessities of life every month. And they have a ration card, and they have to go to a government store to get their ration every week, or in some cases every day. If it's bread, for example, you have to queue up every day and get your ration every day of bread. So people are actually now living completely dependent on this very meager ration. So people's living standards have been squeezed very heavily by the pandemic. And of course, the Cuban government has lost 11% of its earnings. And that's 11%, which is hard currency, because tourism is a hard currency earner, which means that the government's capacity to actually pay its debts abroad have been reduced, which means that the capacity for the state to actually buy the food they need to distribute to people is restrained. And with more people needing the ration, there is a really serious fear of food scarcity. People are already living on very low intake of food, and so there is a serious issue with that, and a great deal of anxiety amongst the Cuban population. So this is one of the causal factors of what happened on July the 11th. So yeah, Edna has asked, is food more expensive now? Yes, it is. Okay, it is more expensive in the sense that the prices have all gone up. What did the Cuban government do? It increased salaries, right? So people who depended on uh, um, who had only salaries in the local peso, the national peso, they were obviously salaries that were very low, because when you made the exchange, the exchange rate was 25 to 1. If you earned 500 pesos, 25 to 1, that was like $20. And with $20, you can't buy very much in a hard currency store. So when they unified the currency, all the prices in the hard currency stores were turned into pesos at 25 to 1. So that meant that everything became really, really expensive. So they had to raise salaries. So they increased salaries by like 300%. Okay. And they decreased prices as much as they could in the stores. So any imported good is really, really expensive. And way out of the reach of people unless they have an income in foreign currency that they can convert. Okay, so the foreign currency income is still vital to people, and that's the other problem. Trump stopped remittances. I mean, he reduced the amount of money that people could send each month. And they also did something which was done right at the end of Trump's presidency, which was to put Cuba on the list of countries that are considered to be sponsors of terrorism, the state sponsors of terrorism list. I mean, they include North Korea. In fact, I don't even think North Korea is on it at the moment, because Trump took it off. But Syria, for example, is on it. Iran is on it. These countries are what are known as state sponsors of terrorism. And what that means is these countries are not allowed to trade in US dollars. So it is illegal for banks to bank or transact in dollars with these countries. Now, even foreign banks can't do it because they get fined in the United States for doing it. Okay, so it means that there is no easy way for a Cuban American to send money now to their family in Cuba. It's very expensive for them to do it. They have to find a way of, but basically they can't send dollars. They have to send euros or sterling or another currency. And they have to find a way of doing it that doesn't involve a bank transfer that might go through an American bank. So if you're an American citizen, that's not easy. So that's had an effect of reducing the amount of money people are receiving. But so what people were doing was, of course, sending people they knew who were going to Cuba. They were actually sending cash. So the travelers who were going to Cuba were acting as mules and taking cash. But since the pandemic, there's no travel, or very, very limited travel. So that possibility has been taken away as well. So not only have people who were living from tourism suffered a massive loss of their living standards, the people that were surviving and depending on money from their family abroad have lost their income. And they are dependent entirely on the Cuban state as well. And they are living in a way which they're not used to living. And that's gone on now for 6 months, since the end of the Trump presidency, when this restriction was brought in. Now, so you've got the pandemic. you've got this collapse of the Cuban economy as a consequence of the pandemic, and as a consequence of what the United States government was doing under Donald Trump, because he imposed lots of sanctions on Cuba, reimposed them. He stopped the travel, he stopped American tourists going, he stopped investment in hotels, he stopped flights. I mean, this downturn predated the pandemic. It had already started under Trump before the pandemic, but the pandemic on top just shut it off completely. It stopped all the Europeans traveling and so on and so on. So you've got a severe economic crisis as a consequence of what the United States was doing and what Trump did. Okay. Yes, I'm going to come on to the pandemic now, Edna. Edna's asking about, I also got Trump's motivations. Well, Trump was, as you know, I guess, very, you would say very right wing. So he's obviously inclined against communism, right? He's a big businessman, capitalist himself. He's obviously viscerally anti-communist. But of course, he's a Republican as well. And he was also a Republican who didn't have complete support from the Republican Party. I mean, the soft wing of the Republican Party didn't really like him, remember? And he kind of hijacked the party. And he hijacked the party by, creating this very extreme sort of white supremacist, anti-immigration, very right-wing element by fostering that. And within that element, these Cuban Americans in Florida and significant Republicans, Marco Rubio is one of them, really the leader of them, who are severely anti-Castro, basically supported Trump, and therefore Trump, to cement the support from them, adopted a very tough on Castro, tough on communism line, and basically started to fulfill policy agenda, which was dictated by these people who are representatives of the very, very wealthy Cubans, families that left in the early part of the revolution. You're talking about here, this is the long-term relationship here, right? When, like I was talking, this first wave of migration that I mentioned in 59-61 was of the bourgeoisie, if you want to call it that, if you use the Marxist term, the upper classes. The upper classes and their coterie, if you like, the middle classes who work for them, the managers and the architects and the lawyers and the doctors and the accountants and all of the professionals that worked at the high levels, the managerial class, if you like, that worked at the high levels for these people that ran Cuba in 59-61, they decamped to their second homes, because a lot of them actually had second homes already in Florida, because they would spend significant amount of time on vacation and stuff in the United States. They went to the United States. They left when they realized that Castro wasn't going to be their puppet. They left, and when they left, they expected to return at some point very promptly, because they were sure the United States was going to decapitate the new government and get rid of Castro. That didn't happen, so they finished up being stranded in the United States. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion and the missile crisis, and that then sent Cuba into the Soviet orbit, and it meant that there was no way they were going to get back. But they've never stopped trying to get back. So they really, these people want to return Cuba to what it was in the 1950s before Castro. It's a kind of a Gatsby-esque fantasy that they can go back to the past, but they, you know, they do feel, they do think that, they do want that, and they want to overthrow the system, and they want to completely eradicate communism and forget the last 60 years, you know. And you know, so they really are driving this policy of Trump. So that's why it's important to understand that this is in the context of the Biden administration that this has happened. Anita says people like the Bacardi family. Absolutely, the Bacardi family is one of the main groups of, let's call them the Cuban American lobby that's within it. Yeah, and the Bacardi family being responsible for actually making the Cuban embargo stronger in the 1990s. They sponsored a law which was known as the HelmsBurton law, which was directly in their interests, which that law basically makes it illegal for makes it illegal in the United States for foreigners to invest in properties that belonged to Cubans prior to 1959. So it basically gives a legal claim for compensation to a Cuban American who owned property in Cuba in 1959, which was nationalized and now maybe being used by a foreign company. So say a European company builds a hotel on a piece of land that was owned by a Cuban American. It gives the Cuban American the right to sue that European company in the United States for compensation for having used that property. It basically recognized the property rights of people that lost property to the Cuban government when it was nationalized. And that was a law that was actually designed by Bacardi's lawyers, and Bacardi sponsored it. They put in the money to lobby the Congress people that passed that law in 1996. Incidentally, that part of the law, which gave that right to sue foreigners, was never enacted. It was always suspended by a presidential waiver because, you know, when it was passed, Bill Clinton was president. He signed the bill into law, but he used the presidential executive authority to waiver parts of the law that he felt would be damaging to US interests. And the part of the law which says that a Cuban American can sue a foreign company was very contested by the European Union. And the European Union basically was very, very angry about that. And so Clinton agreed that he wouldn't sign it. And every president, even Bush, continued to sign that exemption. Trump signed it. He put that bit of the law into action. So now there are hundreds of cases pending in the US courts, which are aimed at European and Canadian companies for having invested in property that are subject to a claim by a Cuban American. And so far, they haven't actually made it, but there is a threat. And that's had an effect as well, because that means that people who might be thinking of investing in Cuba just aren't bothering. Of course, in the pandemic, that hasn't happened anyway, but even if the pandemic weren't there, this would have had a serious effect on the Cuban economy. So you've got an economic situation worsened by the pandemic. Now, what did Cuba do during the pandemic? Well, this is, as has been asked in the Q&A, the first thing they did was actually stop it. They did really well. I mean, they put into action their excellent healthcare system. They don't use these controversial lateral flow tests. They use PCR tests. They found every single person who was infected. They traced all their contacts. They isolated them, and they controlled the epidemic. The incidents were very low, and the deaths are very low, still very low. I mean, like you guys, I mean, to be, I don't wish to, to say anything that might be upsetting to anybody, but we've had 160,000 deaths at least in the UK. And I read the other day that you had 925 in total in Australia. And boy, would we wish for that, I tell you. I mean, that's a fantastic result. And I know that you've got problems now, and it's exactly the same problem that Cuba's got, the Delta variant. The Delta variant's got into Cuba, and the Delta variant is so transmittable, and it's spreading, and it's breached their defenses. And the situation is really bad, and it's because of the food situation. I mean, you can't self-isolate if you've got to go and queue up for your rations, right? You got to get your ration, otherwise you're not going to be able to eat. Cubans have got to go out and queue up. Of course, they're wearing masks. Masks are mandatory everywhere in Cuba, and if you watch Cuban TV, even the TV presenters are wearing masks on television, I guess as an example to the nation, right? So everybody's wearing a mask. But, the masks aren't a complete defense against the transmission, of course. It doesn't guarantee no transmission. And so Delta variant is so transmissible that it's spreading really fast in Cuba. And that is in the background to what's going on, right? So there is enormous anxiety about the Delta variant. So in the immediate prelude to July the 11th, what you got was a spike in the Delta variant in Matanzas, which is a city about 80 kilometers from Havana down the coast to the east. And so it's a city of about 100,000 people. Not a big city, but sizable city. And the Delta variant was so serious there, and the numbers of cases and hospitalizations was so great that they had to basically send emergency teams to Matanzas to deal with it. Yeah, I'll come to the vaccine rollout. Yeah, that's an important point. Somebody's just asked about the vaccines. So Cuba, the way Cuba was going to deal with this was they developed their own vaccine. They've got a very sophisticated biotechnology industry, and they were able to develop vaccines. They've actually got 5 vaccines, 2 of which have gone through the trials and they're using. So they developed their own vaccines. So their plan was quarantine, keep the numbers low, then vaccinate the population. So they started their vaccination program in April, and the plan is to get the entire population vaccinated by the end of the year. And they were hoping to get something like 60% of the population vaccinated by the end of August. They've currently vaccinated well, they're fully vaccinated about 28% now, and they've got 40% having had first doses. The Cuban vaccine requires 3 doses, not 2. So they need to make 33 million injections, basically, which they can do, but they've got problems with, not with the vaccine. They can produce enough of the vaccine, but they haven't got sufficient PPE, and they haven't got enough syringes. Their own manufacturing base can't produce enough to do it rapidly. So they need to import syringes, and because of the situation they're in economically, they've got difficulties with syringes. Recently, there's been a huge campaign, actually in the United States, amongst citizens to collect money to buy syringes for Cuba. So at the same time that the United States government has been doing its best to make the situation worse in Cuba, the United States civil society has been trying to make up for the fact, and they've actually just announced that they've raised enough money to send 6 million syringes to Cuba, which will be a significant donation from the US population itself. They are getting support now from China, Russia, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia. Of course, these are all poor countries themselves. Russia, Vietnam, they're all beginning to send aid to Cuba since the incident in July 11th, to alleviate the situation there. And so things are easing slightly, but the situation is still quite serious. But to go back to the prelude to July the 11th, just to understand, this spike happened in late June in Matanzas. So there was a national alarm. The government had to send beds and doctors and nurses to Matanzas to deal with this spike. And Matanzas was not a place which had been, in the vaccination program yet. They were vaccinating in the centers where there had been significant circulation of the previous variants, which had been more or less controlled, but they started in Havana, for example, in the very densely populated areas of Havana, where transmission was highest, and the people in Matanzas hadn't been vaccinated. They were very vulnerable, and so you got, with this alarm around the Delta variant, you got an enormous amount of anxiety arising in the Cuban population who hadn't been vaccinated. So you've got people living and have been living under very, very restricted economic circumstances for a long time. You have a worsening of those circumstances amongst people who had actually been living very well suddenly because of the pandemic and the collapse of tourism. And you have a worsening of the situation in relation to the United States, people not being able to visit their families, people not being able to receive visits from their families. You've got the Trump administration making the situation even harder. And then you get the Biden administration. Now, what did Biden do? I don't know if you know the theory of rising expectations, but, there is this acknowledgement amongst historians that many revolutions and uprisings and rebellions happen not when the population has been depressed for a long time, but when the population thinks that the depression is going to lift and then it doesn't. You get this disappointment factor which tips people over. So what did Biden do? Well, Biden, during his election campaign, promised he was going to return to the policies of the Obama administration. So when Biden was elected, you can't imagine how happy Cubans were, because they were thinking, phew, the nightmare's over. Trump is gone. The Wicked Witch is dead. And things are going to get better. But Biden has done nothing. He did nothing to ease the pressure. He just said, Cuba is not a priority. And of course, this has made the situation worse. Now, what was the spark? Well, there are two things. The first thing is there was a accident. Something happened at one of the major power plants in Cuba, which knocked it out. There was a mechanical failure of some kind at one of the electrical power generation plants, one of the big ones, one of the main ones that supplied the national grid. And that produced a shortage of electricity. And the government, well, there was a sudden power outage for a lot of people, unannounced, because this power plant went down. And then when it was realized that the spare parts to repair it needed to be imported, it wasn't going to be a quick repair. There was going to be a shortage of electricity. So the government suddenly announced there were going to be power cuts. Staged and timed, but power cuts. And that brought back memories of what happened in the 90s, when there was a prolonged period of power cuts. And that brought back the idea, the nightmare, that there was going to be worse to come. And so that increased the anxiety amongst a lot of people. But then what you got was a Twitter campaign, a social media campaign, which originated in the United States, originated in Miami. Hashtag SOS Cuba, hashtag SOS Matanzas. And this was calling for a humanitarian corridor of aid to be opened up between the United States and Cuba to resolve the humanitarian crisis that was taking off in Cuba, that people were starving, that the people were without electricity, that people were dying in their thousands from COVID, that the system was collapsing, and so on. And it was saying that Cuba was actually refusing to accept assistance from other countries, was refusing donations, and the government was making the situation deliberately worse. Of course, the Cuban government was forced actually to make an announcement to say that that wasn't true. They were accepting donations basically from everywhere, but what they weren't doing was accepting donations from US aid and the US government that had strings attached and all kinds of conditions attached to them. But they were accepting charity donations from everywhere. That just wasn't true. And the Cuban government was actually forced to go on television to try and quell this rumor that had started in Cuba through social media. So what happened on July the 11th was when this uprising started in San Antonio de los Baños, this little town, there were pictures of it spread on these Twitter accounts and these social media accounts that the people use, showing pictures of this uprising and calling on people to do the same everywhere, and that this was, you know, the end of the system. So they kind of like created a social media storm, which lots of young people, of course, use, and they were encouraged to demonstrate and go out on the streets. And so that's what happened. People did, and that's what caused this thing. And so when some young people started to demonstrate, of course, other people joined. So you got groups of people not shouting. Some people were shouting libertad, 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 freedom, freedom, freedom. But other people were shouting, we want bread, we want vaccines, we want to be vaccinated. And a lot of people were complaining about economic problems. I don't know if you saw any of the footage on the news, but you know, one of the ones that was repeated a lot on our television in Britain was this guy talking to a camera amongst the demonstrators saying they've got enough money to build big hotels, but they haven't got enough money to build houses for us. So people were voicing complaints about the economic situation. They weren't necessarily voicing opposition to the government. To interpret these demonstrations, such as they were, as being anti-government demonstrations is maybe not correct either. They are protesting about the situation they're in. They're not necessarily calling for a change of government. So that kind of contextualizes everything. It makes everything very different. Now, when the riots began, we also got a huge social media storm in the West. I mean, when I say the West, I mean folks like us, right? So one of the things that was interesting was the way in which this was reported in the British media. I mean, you guys don't get the British media, I guess, but you get your own media. But I know, for example, you know a lot more about this Australian-born journalist, Julian Assange, who is in prison in Britain than we do, right? Our news doesn't report very much about poor Julian, but I know that even Sky News Australia has had packets on the plight of Julian Assange. So news coverage is different everywhere. But in Britain, the coverage on the Cuba thing was showing, like, for example, the Guardian newspaper showed a picture of this massive crowd of demonstrators in Havana, and it had the caption, "Anti-government demonstrators in Havana." But when you looked at the picture closely, you realized these were actually pro-government demonstrators. And what transpired was there were pictures being circulated of huge crowds, apparently on the streets, thousands of people on the streets of Havana. And when it was looked at more closely, this picture was actually of Egypt at the time of the 2011 Arab uprising. And they were showing pictures of people being hit by policemen, and they claimed they were Cuban policemen, and they were actually pictures of Colombian policemen beating people up on the streets of Bogota, and they were giving them captions that were supposed to be Cuba. So there was this huge exaggeration in the media of what was going on there. There wasn't that number of people on the streets, and the situation wasn't nearly as serious as it was being portrayed. So there was this huge exaggeration, and since July the 11th, it's transpired that this was originated in a huge social media operation, which was located in companies in Miami. And so this, let's call it Cuban uprising, was to a large extent engendered by elements in the United States. Now, whether or not there was direct involvement by the Washington government in the organization of that is not clear, because these companies that were responsible for this, and you were talking about this technique of robots and trolls. You're talking about accounts that were set up. I mean, they found out that there was something like 10 million Twitter accounts established, on the 10th of July, none of which have followers, right? So this social media storm was, a confection. It was a concoction. It was a propaganda campaign. It was done by companies in Miami. They have, however, established that there was a link to Washington because some of these companies were funded, or these organizations were funded by the US government indirectly. They'd received funding from foundations like the National Endowment for Democracy. The National Endowment for Democracy is basically a front organization. It's supposed to be a civil society organization. It's like a charity that helps and funds the development of democracy around the world. But in actual fact, it's an NGO that is actually entirely funded by the US government. So it kind of gets US government money, and then it uses that money to do things that the US government wants it to do. So it's a kind of front organization for the US State Department. And it's a tool of foreign policy, basically. So the National Endowment for Democracy, US aid, the US government development agency, which gave money as well. So indirectly, they've been funded by Washington, but whether they're acting under orders from Washington, we don't really know. But we do know that they intentionally been developing this network in Cuba of people that were, you know, primed to carry out this agitation. So this was quite a sophisticated operation, and so this is all now being exposed, of course, in Cuba. So the Cuban government has been very good at investigating and explaining and to the Cuban population what lay behind a lot of the people that were carrying out, the sort of instigators of these demonstrations, and essentially, you know, they are being identified slowly now as being, in some ways, either unwitting dupes and agents of this this organization, which is rooted in Miami. So what you can't do is divorce this from this relationship with the United States. Now, why? The internet. That's the thing. The internet, basically. I mean, the Cubans opened up the internet to Cubans. I mean, there are Wi-Fi hotspots everywhere that are free, you know, all over the country. So, you know, this was possible. This was possible to do because Cubans, they've all got smartphones and they've all got Wi-Fi access, and they're all, you know, they're all now interconnected. I can talk to my friends in Cuba using WhatsApp, free, basically, you know, and they can talk to me free. So, you know, Cuba's connected. So one of the things, of course, that the Cuban government did was it shut down the internet in order to stop the spread of this stuff on July the 11th. And of course, they were heavily criticized for that. I mean, that was used against them by the enemies. Oh, they've shut down the internet. This is communist dictatorship, etc. I mean, the internet's back up now, and things are returning. Well, things have returned to normal in a sense that there's calm. They're still battling with this problem that they've got, you know, the pandemic and the economy. And of course, the US government has responded to this. The Biden administration has responded by putting more sanctions on the Cubans, not less. They've sanctioned the Cubans even more. And they've claimed that Cuba is a failed state, that this is an indication that communism has failed, and it's time that Cubans were free, and that he's going to help liberate Cuba. Well, he's singing to the tune of the Cuban American lobby. And the reasons for that are interesting. I mean, they didn't win the election, the Republicans, but the Republicans have retained significant control of significant committees in the Senate and so forth. And the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, for example, and other committees are dominated, and some of these are basically dominated by Republicans who are very much in favor of trying to overthrow the government in Cuba. And they've obviously used leverage on the Biden administration because the Biden administration wants to get stuff done to help with its own pandemic problems and its own economic problems. And in order to get bipartisan agreement on things like, you know, this massive spending program that they've started to try and grow out of the recession that the pandemic's caused, he's had to kind of sell out on lots of issues which are dear to the Republicans. And one of them, you know, Marco Rubio is very powerful, you know, is Cuba. So it would appear that the Biden administration has been basically following the policy that has been, you know, dictated by these very, you know, anti-communist Cuban American lobbyists and politicians, and therefore has not made any change to the policies that they got Trump to introduce, and that's made the situation worse. And now he's in a kind of a bind, because he's also got this rhetoric about China. I know you guys in Australia are very concerned about China, and Biden has gone really tough on China as well, and he's kind of talked up about, you know, opposing the threat of communism, you know, and he's talked about Xinjiang and the Uyghur people, and he's been heavy on human rights in China, and he's kind of, you know, talked up the rhetoric of anti-communism against China. So now he's got a situation where he's got a communist country on his doorstep, which, you know, he needs to do something about, but he can't do something which is seen to aid a communist country, because he's kind of made this thing about liberal democracy being the answer, and, you know, going back on this kind of big sort of rhetorical freedom and human rights thing, and so on. He's in a situation where he can't easily help the Cuban government get over this problem. So this is a headache. Somebody said it seems as though this is a classic case that if the US were to help the economy of Cuba, they wouldn't have the hordes coming across. Would you agree with that? Well, that's right. So there is a kind of a paradoxical situation arising here now. I mean, it always was there, but it's coming to a head. What the US needs to do is reduce the pressure on Cuba, because it will result in a migration crisis, because that's what's happened before. And ironically, it happened before under Democratic administrations. I mean, there was this migration crisis called the Mariel boat lift in 1980, which was under Carter. And there was the Rafters crisis in 94, which was under Clinton. And now we've got Biden. And it would appear that the same kind of scenario could arise, where we're going to get large numbers of Cubans leaving the island in boats. And they have been doing that. You know, there have been an increase in the numbers of Cubans trying to leave the island in boats in the last few weeks. And in fact, before July the 11th, there were people leaving Cuba in boats. It was already something that was seen to be a probability. So there is the need to ease the pressure on Cuba to prevent that from happening. But actually what's happening is the conditions are being created to actually create that situation, not the reverse, because the US is not easing off. It's actually doubling down at the moment. Biden has said, well, we're looking at ways to try and make remittances possible, but we've got to make sure that they don't get into the hands of people who support the government. Well, that's kind of, how are they going to do that? How are you possibly going to distribute money to Cubans from the United States and guarantee that the money isn't going to get into the hands of people who support the government? That's just not possible, you know. And of course that won't work. I mean, it's just not. So how they're going to do that is like that's crazy. So they're in a situation where they've got themselves in a situation where they can't help Cuba without being seen to be soft. And if they do help Cuba, if they don't help Cuba, they're going to get a migration crisis. And then what's going to happen? The people in Florida, these right-wing people, in fact, certain politicians have already said, if there's a migration crisis, we should invade. I mean, that's serious. But that's been said already. Okay. How likely is that? Well, how bad will the migration crisis get? How bad will the situation in Cuba get? If there is such food scarcity that people begin to, get health problems, serious health problems as a consequence of food scarcity, malnutrition type things, and there are further disturbances, then some kind of military intervention in Cuba may not actually be beyond the bounds of possibility. Let's think about that. I'm sure you'll get it, but is there pushback in the US against Biden's approach? Well, there is pushback. There has been a big campaign and a petition called Let Cuba Live. And there was a full-page ad taken in the New York Times, which was paid for by subscription of individuals, contributions. I was amongst the signatories to the letter to Biden. The first letter that was sent had 4,000 signatories from very significant people. I mean, obviously people like Noam Chomsky, but also Danny Glover, Ari Belafonte, the number of politicians signed it, senators and congressmen that are in favor of engagement with Cuba signed it. And there have been outspoken comments made by some politicians on the Democratic left. Certainly, of course, the radical left of the Democratic Party have said that Biden should change his approach. But Senator McGovern, for example, of New Jersey, who's long been an advocate of engagement with Cuba, has spoken out and said that the Biden administration has got to do something. There is, yes, definitely voices and significant voices in Cuba that are calling for an easing of the pressure and a return to the more engagement type approach that Obama took. So there is that, and that is actually one of the reasons for hoping that this more hard line approach will get tempered eventually. Maybe what the Biden administration is doing at the moment is biding, excuse the pun, biding for time. That they know they've got to change, they've got to do something, but they've got to find a moment when they can do it without suffering a lot of flack for doing it. Maybe there are some serious discussions going on. We don't know, but in Cuba, the Cuban government, like I said, has actually gone on the let's say ideological offensive. They've exposed this Twitter social media conspiracy thing. They've explained it very well to the Cuban people. They called on Cubans, like I said, to demonstrate in the streets. And the week after, on the Saturday after the demonstrations, or the Sunday after, the weekend after, they organized an enormous demonstration on the streets of Havana, which attracted like 600,000 people. So they actually mobilized the support of the supporters. Now, this is my point that I started with. The Cuban government can count on the support of vast numbers of people in Cuba. I won't say the majority, but I'll say of an overwhelmingly significant minority. And I say that because if you look at the figures of, for example, membership of the Communist Party and the Young Communist Party, there are something like 1.2 million people who are members of either the Young Communist Party or the Communist Party itself. Now, the population in Cuba is 11 million, but if you discount the children, you know, you're talking about 7 million people. And then if you discount the very old, which is a significant proportion of the population, because of course they've got an incredible life expectancy and longevity. If you discount the old people, you're talking about maybe 5-6 million people in total who could possibly be be active members of the Communist Party. So of those, that's 1 in 6. So 1 in 6 of working age people are actually members of the Communist Party. And of course, as well as them, there are lots and lots of people who are not in the Communist Party who consider themselves to be loyal revolutionaries. So any kind of estimate, you're going to have, there isn't going to be a family in Cuba that doesn't have somebody within it who is not a member of the Communist Party. There's going to be somebody who will be a member of the Communist Party. The Communist Party is massive in relation to the population, and it reaches down, down into the barrios. And of course, in the barrios, there are citizen organizations. The government has been under siege from, the United States, let's say, for the last 60 years. And it organized itself in order to defend itself against the United States in classical ways. So there are, citizen networks. They're called the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. They're neighborhood, street-based committees of loyal citizens who are organized to defend the revolution. And it's a massive citizen network of people across the island. Every street has a committee for the defense of the revolution, and every street has a little office where there is a notice board of the committee for the defense of the revolution, where notices are put up about what people should be doing. And the citizen organization does all kinds of work in the community. It's it has a kind of social welfare role. They go around and knock on doors and see people who've have got people who are ill in their family to make sure they're okay. They make sure that people with babies get their babies vaccinated. They are mobilized when there's any kind of health emergency, like dengue fever, which happens quite a lot. You get outbreaks of mosquitoes that can carry dengue, and so they're mobilized when they have to get citizens to act on that. They organize cleanups of the neighborhood. They organize litter campaigns and stuff like that. So these citizen organizations are big. Lots of people are in them, and they can be mobilized. Sorry,
Stevens, sorry to wind you up. Sorry to wind you up. We've just got one last question. I think we'll have to wind it up because I think you're getting a bit like Fidel Castro going on.
Okay.
Anita's asked a very relevant question, just saying, just as Cuba got driven into the arms of the Soviet Union in the late 50s, early 60s, do you think it's possible China could step into the breach?
Well, it is. That's exactly right. I mean, and that's the other thing, is that the policy is counterproductive from the Americans' point of view, because, of course, it will only make Cuba more dependent on China than it already is. I mean, China is very, very important to Cuba. I mean, anybody from academy travel will tell you who went to Cuba with our trips, we traveled in a Chinese bus. There aren't any buses in Cuba that aren't Chinese, and the Geely cars are running this around the streets. The Chinese are big benefactor in Cuba, huge benefactor. And so of course China's got everything to gain by helping Cuba right now. No, that's great. Look, seriously, it's just been absolutely fantastic. It's just most illuminating, and obviously something so relevant that we can be watching now for the next 6 months, a year, 2 years. Be fascinating to see what Biden does do, what America does do. And there is that ultimate irony that during the Obama administration, the capitalism was actually improving the Cuban economy, and they actually were getting better. And it was slowly, that spread of liberalism was spreading. But anyway, Trump has a lot to answer for. Anyway, we'll let you go because we know it's early in the morning for you. I hope everybody enjoyed that. And it's been a real pleasure to kind of be able to talk like this so freely, because this is going on in my head all the time, and you don't often get this opportunity. So I really appreciate that. Well, we appreciate it very much, Stephen. Thank you so very much for getting up early for us. We greatly appreciate it. We'll have to get you back again.